A bitter cold swept through the wilderness as a brutal snowstorm battered a remote cabin deep in the mountains. Inside, a solitary woman sat by the fire, savoring the warmth against the icy night. But her peace was shattered by a sound, a desperate scratching at the door, followed by soft, pitiful whimpers when she opened it. What she found left her breathless, a grizzly bear and her 3 tiny cubs huddled together, shivering and barely alive. What happened next is a story of courage, compassion, and an act of humanity that defied all odds. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications to experience more incredible stories. Like this one, the storm raged outside the small wooden cabin nestled in the shadow of a snow-covered mountain range. Evelyn Harper, a retired nurse in her mid-50s, sat by the flickering fireplace, clutching a mug of tea. She had come to this secluded retreat seeking solace after the loss of her husband, a place where the world felt distant and quiet. Tonight, however, the silence was broken. A strange noise cut through the howling wind, a faint rhythmic scratching. At the door, Evelyn froze her heart, skipping a beat. Living in the wilderness meant encounters with wildlife were not uncommon, but this sound felt different. It wasn't the wind rattling the windows or branches scraping the roof. It was deliberate, pleading cautiously. She stood and approached the door. "Who's there?" she murmured, her voice trembling even. Though she knew no one would answer, taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The icy wind rushed in, making her gasp. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight before her, a massive grizzly bear standing just feet away, its fur matted with snow and its breath visible in the freezing air at its feet. 3 tiny cubs huddled together, their small bodies trembling violently. The mother bear looked exhausted, her head low, her eyes meeting Evelyn's with an intensity that stopped her breath for a moment. Neither moved. Evelyn's instincts screamed at her to slam the door and bolt it shut. But something in the bear's gaze made her pause. It wasn't aggression or anger, it was desperation. The cubs let out soft whimpers, their tiny cries barely audible over the wind. "What in the world?" Evelyn whispered, her mind racing. She knew the risks of being this close to a bear, especially a mother protecting her young, yet she couldn't bring herself to turn them away. They looked so vulnerable, so out of place in the relentless storm. Carefully, Evelyn opened the door wider. The mother bear didn't move, her eyes never leaving Evelyn's. The cubs stayed pressed against their mother's legs, their shivering growing more pronounced. Evelyn's gaze dropped to the snow beneath them, where she saw small streaks of red. One of the cubs was injured, its tiny paw leaving faint trails of blood in the pristine white. "Oh, you poor things," she murmured, her voice cracking her mind, wed with logic. Letting wild animals near the house was dangerous, reckless even, but leaving them out there in the storm felt cruel, a death sentence. Evelyn grabbed a thick wool blanket from the couch and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit her like a wall, but she pushed forward, laying the blanket a few feet from the bears. "Here," she said softly. "It's not much, but it's something." The mother bear sniffed the air, her massive head lowering to inspect the blanket slowly. She nudged her cubs forward, encouraging them to step onto the warm fabric. Evelyn's heart ached deep as she watched the tiny creatures curl up together, their shivering easing slightly. She backed away, returning to the doorway. "You can stay there," she said, unsure if the bear could understand her tone, but hoping her actions conveyed peace. The mother bear glanced at her, then lay down beside her, cubs shielding them from the wind with her massive body. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame, watching the scene unfold. She had seen bears in the wild before, but never like this, never so close, so vulnerable for the first time in months. She felt something stir in her chest. It was a faint glimmer of purpose, a reminder that life, no matter how wild or unpredictable, was worth protecting. As the fire crackled behind her and the storm howled, beyond, Evelyn made a silent vow she would do whatever it took to help them survive the night. Evelyn spent the rest of the night near the door, peeking out at the bear family. Every so often, the sight of the mother bear lying protectively over her cubs, shielding them from the bitter cold, tugged at her heart. She couldn't help but feel an odd sense of connection with the animals. It wasn't just the desperation in their eyes, it was the reminder of what it meant to lose someone you loved and fight to keep going. But as the hours ticked by, Evelyn noticed the smallest cub wasn't moving much, while the others shifted restlessly, occasionally nudging each other. The little one remained curled tightly in the center of the blanket, its tiny body trembling uncontrollably. Her chest tightened. Something was wrong. She opened the door slightly, careful not to make sudden movements that might alarm the mother bear. The bitter wind swept into the cabin, but Evelyn barely noticed. "Hey," she called softly, her voice trembling. "Are they okay?" The mother bear raised her massive head, her eyes locking onto Evelyn's. The intensity of the gaze sent a chill down her spine, but she held her ground slowly. The bear nudged the smallest cub with her nose, encouraging it to move. The cubs heard weakly but didn't respond much. Evelyn's heart sank. She couldn't just stand by and watch. But what could she do approaching the bears? Directly was unthinkable, yet leaving the injured cub out in the freezing cold felt cruel. Evelyn's mind raced, weighing her options. Finally, she decided to take a risk. Grabbing her first aid kit from the kitchen, she bundled herself in, her warmest coat and gloves. "All right," she muttered to herself, trying to muster courage. "Let's hope you don't see this as a threat." Evelyn stepped out onto the porch, moving slowly, deliberately. The mother bear's head followed her every move, her body tensing slightly as Evelyn crouched a few feet away. She held up her hands, showing she meant no harm. "I just want to help," she said softly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The mother bear let out a low huff, her eyes narrowing. Evelyn held her breath, waiting for a sign, any sign that she wasn't making a grave mistake after what felt like an eternity. The bear relaxed, slightly lowering her, and head back to the cubs. Evelyn took it as permission. She inched closer to the blanket, keeping her movements slow and her eyes on the mother bear. When she reached the edge, she knelt down, carefully examining the smallest cub. The little one's paw was swollen and bleeding, likely from a sharp branch or a hidden trap. Its tiny body felt cold, even through its thick fur. "Oh, you poor thing," Evelyn murmured, her voice thick with emotion. She worked quickly cleaning the wound with antiseptic wipes and wrapping the paw in gauze. The cub whimpered softly but didn't struggle, too weak to resist. The mother bear let out another low huff, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was almost a sigh, as if she understood what Evelyn was doing. When Evelyn finished, she gently tucked the coop back into the blanket. She stood slowly, backing away with her hands up. "All done," she said quietly. Retreating to the safety of the cabin inside, she collapsed into a chair, her hands trembling. The adrenaline coursing through her body was overwhelming, but so was the relief she had done what she could. Now it was up to the bears in nature to decide what happened next morning. Broke with a faint glow piercing through the heavy clouds. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, clutching a mug of coffee to keep her hands warm. The storm had finally eased, leaving a thick blanket of snow across the landscape. The bear family was still there. The mother, watching her closely as she approached the door, the smallest cub stirred, moving for the first time with a bit more energy. Evelyn's heart lifted at the sight. The wound on its paw was still visible, but it seemed stable for now. "You're stronger than you look," she whispered, her breath fogging. In the cold air, the mother bear stood shaking off the snow that had accumulated on her massive frame. She nudged her cubs, encouraging them to move. Evelyn realized with a pang of sadness that they were preparing to leave. The family found shelter for the night, but they couldn't stay. Evelyn watched as the mother led her cubs into the forest, their small forms disappearing into the trees. Her heart ached with worry. Would they survive the harsh winter? Had she done enough? Before the mother bear vanished completely, she stopped at the edge of the tree line and turned. For a brief moment, her eyes met Evelyn's. It wasn't just a look, it was something deeper. A silent understanding passed between them, a connection forged in the storm. Evelyn stood there long after the bears were gone, the cold creeping into her bones. She had spent so long grieving her own losses, feeling powerless in the face of life's challenges. But now, for the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could still make a difference. The days after the bear family's departure felt strangely empty. Evelyn went about her routines, chopping wood, gathering snow to melt for water, and tending to her small garden of indoor herbs. Yet her thoughts constantly drifted to the bears. She found herself scanning the tree line whenever she ventured outside, hoping for a glimpse of their hulking forms against the white backdrop of the forest. Her life had been quiet since her husband's passing. The solitude of the wilderness, which she had sought for healing, now felt heavier, lonelier, but the bears had stirred something in her, a sense of purpose, of connection. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt like she mattered to something greater than herself. Then, 3 nights later, the scratching returned. Evelyn shot up from her chair by the fire, her pulse quickening. She grabbed her flashlight and cautiously approached the door. When she opened it, The icy wind bit at her face, but it wasn't the cold that took her breath away. The mother bear was back. Her massive frame loomed in the faint glow of the flashlight, and her 3 cubs huddled close to her legs, but something was wrong. The bears looked thinner, their fur caked with frost. The smallest cub, the one Evelyn had treated, seemed especially weak, its movements sluggish and unsteady. "Oh no," Evelyn whispered, her heart sinking. The mother bear didn't growl or move threateningly. Instead, she stood silently, her dark eyes fixed on Evelyn. It was as if she remembered the woman who had helped her cub and was now asking for help again. Evelyn hesitated for only a moment before grabbing her thickest coat and stepping onto the porch. She scanned the bears, her nurse's instincts kicking in. The mother bear's movements were slower than before, her breathing heavy. The cubs were clearly starving, their once-place energy now replaced with exhaustion. "Wait here," Evelyn murmured, retreating inside to gather supplies. She didn't know what she could do for them, but she wasn't going to turn them away. Evelyn returned with a large bowl of oatmeal mixed with honey, a small stash she had reserved for emergencies. She set it down near the blanket she had left outside, then backed away slowly. The mother bear sniffed the air and cautiously approached. Her cubs, following the smallest cubs, struggled to keep up, its injured paw dragging slightly in the snow as the bears began to eat. Evelyn watched with a mixture of relief and sadness. She knew this wasn't a sustainable solution. Feeding wild animals was dangerous for both humans and the animals, but she couldn't ignore their suffering. When the mother bear finished eating, she lay down near the blanket, her body shielding the cubs from the cold. Evelyn stood in the doorway, torn between her instincts to help and the harsh reality of the situation. These bears needed more than food. They needed safety shelter and a chance to recover. Evelyn made a decision. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. It rang several times before. A familiar voice answered Evelyn. The man said, his tone both surprised and concerned. "Is everything all right, David?" Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "I need your help, David," was a wildlife biologist and an old friend of Evelyn's late husband. He had often visited the cabin during their early years in the wilderness, studying the local bear population. If anyone could help these animals, it was him. The next morning, David arrived in a large truck, his face a mix of worry and curiosity. As Evelyn explained the situation, "They're right over there," she said, pointing toward the clearing where the bears were resting. David whistled softly. "When he saw them, you weren't kidding. They're in bad shape. They won't survive the winter like this," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "Can't we do something?" David nodded thoughtfully. "There's a wildlife reserve. About an hour from here, they have the resources to care for bears like these, but we'll need to tranquilize them for transport. It's not going to be easy." Evelyn felt a pang of guilt. The bears had come to her in trust, and now she was planning to capture them, but she knew it was their best chance. "Let's do it," she said firmly. David spent the afternoon preparing the tranquilizer darts and setting up transport crates in the truck. Evelyn watched anxiously as he worked, her eyes drifting to the bears. The mother bear lay still, her breaths slow and steady, while the cubs curled against her side. When everything was ready, David turned to Evelyn. "This might get loud," he warned. "She's not going to go down without a fight." Evelyn nodded, her heart pounding. "Just be careful." As David loaded the tranquilizer gun, Evelyn stood on the porch, her hands clenched tightly. She prayed silently that the mother bear would understand they were trying to help. The chapter ends as David takes aim, the tranquilizer dart poised to deliver both hope and heartbreak. The tranquilizer gun was raised, its barrel glinting faintly in the winter sun. David stood perfectly still, his breath controlled as he took aim at the mother bear. Evelyn clenched her fist, raws tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was the right thing to do, but watching the scene unfold felt like a betrayal of the fragile trust. The bears had placed in her. The soft thud of the dart-striking fur broke the stillness. The mother bear let out a startled growl, her massive head snapping toward the source of the sting. David quickly stepped back, his hand already preparing another dart in case she charged. But the bear didn't charge. Instead, she stumbled, her legs trembling as the tranquilizer took effect. Her cubs squealed in confusion, pressing close to her legs as she swayed unsteadily. Evelyn's chest tightened at the sight. "She's fighting it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. David nodded grimly. "She's strong. It's going to take a minute." The mother bear let out a low growl, her eyes darting between Evelyn and David as if pleading for her cubs. Slowly, she collapsed into the snow, her massive body heaving. With labored breaths, The cubs began to cry, pawing at her fur in a desperate attempt to wake her. Evelyn couldn't take it anymore. She rushed forward, ignoring David's warning to stay back. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice breaking as she knelt a few feet away from the cubs. "She's just sleeping. She'll be all right." The smallest cub, the one with the bandaged paw, wobbled toward her, its tiny frame trembling. Evelyn held out her gloved hand, her eyes filling with tears as the cub sniffed cautiously. "You're so brave," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I promise you'll be safe." David approached cautiously, a second tranquilizer. "Dart in hand, we need to move quickly. The tranquilizer won't last long and we can't risk the cubs running off." The tranquilizer gun raised its barrel, glinting faintly in the winter sun. David stood perfectly still, his breath controlled as he took aim at the mother bear. Evelyn clenched her fists tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was the right thing to do, but watching the scene unfold felt like a betrayal of the fragile trust the bears had placed in her. The soft thud of the dart striking fur broke the stillness. The mother bear let out a startled growl, her massive head snapping toward the source of the sting. David quickly stepped back his hand, already preparing another dart in case she charged, but the bear didn't charge. Instead, she stumbled, her legs trembling as the tranquilizer took effect. Her cubs squealed in confusion, pressing close to her legs as she swayed unsteadily. Evelyn's chest tightened at the sight. "She's fighting it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. David nodded grimly. "She's strong. It's going to take a minute." The mother bear let out a low growl, her eyes darting between Evelyn and David as if pleading for her. Cubs slowly, she collapsed into the snow, her massive body heaving with labored breaths. The cubs began to cry, pawing at her fur in a desperate attempt to wake her. Evelyn couldn't take it anymore. She rushed forward, ignoring David's warning to stay back. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice breaking as she knelt a few feet away from the cubs. "She's just sleeping. She'll be all right." The smallest cub, the one with the bandaged paw, wobbled toward her, its tiny frame trembling. Evelyn held out her gloved hand, her eyes filling with tears as the cub sniffed cautiously. "You're so brave," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I promise you'll be safe." David approached, cautiously, a second tranquilizer dart in hand. "We need to move quickly. The tranquilizer won't last long, and we can't risk the cubs running off." Transporting the bears was a delicate and emotional process. David worked swiftly, loading the mother bear onto a padded sled with